judge didn't accept that, and Aaron's firm fought against that. So it forced them to actually release these documents in a timeline that would prevent anyone but our like ancestors and pardon me, not our progeny's progeny from reviewing the documents. Securing religious exemptions to mandated vaccines for over 400,000 students in Mississippi, over 300,000 students in the University of California system, where I previously hailed for this position, and deposing leading vaccinologists. Previously, he clerked for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Israel, and he's a graduate of UC Berkeley School of Law. He's frequently interviewed by national media, and I'll tell you that when you're a physician, one of the things you learn, there's never a day that goes by that you don't learn something when you're taking care of patients. There's just always something new that patients present you with. There are always new opportunities to learn more about a disease condition, treatment options, even just directly from the patient in terms of what's going on. And it's sort of an interesting thing about being a physician, the fact that that's true. But I appreciate, I always consider myself a student, and I'll tell you that I have benefited so much from the writings of Aaron Siri. Just as an example, were it not for Aaron Siri, many people, including myself, would not know to this day that, say, if you look at the hepatitis B vaccines that are approved for infants, as hard, frankly, virtually impossible as it is to believe this, there are two vaccines that are hepatitis B vaccines that are approved for infants. Both of those vaccines were approved on 4 or 5 days of safety data. That was it in the clinical trials for the data that were submitted to the FDA. 4 or 5 days of safety data, and that's it. And things like that, and that's been true. That's been true ever since the day of approval. But were it not for Aaron Siri, scouring through these FDA documents, I wouldn't know that, and so many other people wouldn't know that, and many people were aghast to hear that. But that's it's a fact, and it's and it's an important fact because it's a remarkable fact to approve something for a baby, whatever that thing is. I mean, it can be, it could be eardrops. I mean, it doesn't matter. But to approve something for a baby after observing, a few dozen babies in a clinical trial for 5 days and saying that, that's sufficient is just a remarkable fact. And it brings insight to the regulatory environment. It clearly brings insight to the regulatory environment. And that's the kind of contribution and the type of insight that Aaron Siri has made possible. And that's literally just scratching the surface. I've learned so much from this man. And, and I look forward to hearing his talk. And he has a great book called Vaccines Amen, which I recommend to anyone who's curious to read. I've read it. Just an excellent, excellent book. All right, Aaron, thank you for coming to join us.
Thank you. Let's get this. All right. Should I shut this off then? Okay. Oh, appreciate that. Thank you for the high expectation introduction. I'll try to live up to it. Thank you all for joining me today. I know lawyers may not be your favorite folks to hear from, so I'm trying to make it as pleasant as possible. Grab this clicker. So just to see if this. Okay, as the Surgeon General mentioned, I'm the managing partner of Siri & Glimstad. My law firm has over 100 professionals. About half of them do vaccine-related work of one stripe or another. And so I believe we have the largest vaccine-related practice in the world that I'm aware of that does not represent pharmaceutical companies. So for over a decade, we have sued probably hundreds of lawsuits against federal, state health agencies, as well as pharmaceutical companies to some degree, though they typically can't be sued, as well as numerous other types of lawsuits. We also represent the vaccine injured. We don't sue pharma companies for that. Typically, we have to bring claims in the Federal Court of Claims, and we bring all of those different lawsuits about vaccines because we're not medical doctors, we don't have MPHs or PhDs. We have to prove what we submit regarding vaccines with primary sources with evidence. And so that's will be what I'll be walking through today during the presentation. You'll also find as I go through everything in this slide deck, there is a source at the bottom of every slide. I do not, you shouldn't take anything I say at face value. You should rely on the actual primary sources. So that'll either be on the screen and then you actually can check the sources yourself. Also the author of a book, as the Surgeon General said, called Vaccines, Amen. And a lot of the, do I need to aim this someplace in particular to get it to work? There we go. A lot of the work that you will hear about today is, a lot of it was supported by a nonprofit called the Informed Consent Action Network that supported bringing some of the lawsuits that resulted in the disclosures, many of the disclosures you're going to hear about today. Okay. So is there a, do you want me to just tell you next? Okay. So I'm going to start with the argument for mandates, because I know that that's a thing in Florida right now in particular, and I figured that would be a good place to start. I know there's an initiative here to give folks back their right to choose without coercion whether or not to take a medical product, otherwise known as informed consent. You inform the individual the risks and benefits, they choose whether or not to consent, and if they say no, that should be the end of it. And if you then say no, but yes, you said no, but your kid can't go to school, you can't get a job, that is destructive to informed consent. It removes the consent component of informed consent. And so the state of Florida has been leading the way in terms of securing that right. That doesn't mean anybody will be deprived the ability to get a vaccine. Everybody can still get as many vaccines as they want. The idea is just to respect the rights of those who decide they want to decline without any penalty. So next slide, please. Next slide. All right. The argument for mandates are that they prevent transmission, right? Hence community immunity, otherwise known as herd immunity. Of course, why don't we, for example, mandate heart medicine? Remember during COVID, they said you're clogging up the healthcare system. That's why you have to get the COVID shot. Well, nothing clogs up the healthcare system more than cardiovascular disease. 900,000 Americans die a year. It probably clogs up the medical system more than anything else. Do we mandate statins, exercise, eating well? No. Why not? It's intuitively destructive to liberty. People understand that. But with vaccines, they make the exception because they say, well, they prevent transmission. Well, let's see how, let's go through the various vaccines that are required in Florida in regards to that argument. Next slide, please. Here's the child immunization schedule in Florida for kindergarten through 12. It's essentially 5 vaccines: pertussis-containing vaccine, polio vaccine, MMR, Hep B, and chickenpox vaccine, varicella. Next slide, please. Interesting thing happened is that no matter how many doses of pertussis vaccine were being required, we're now up to 6 doses in childhood, and now the CDC schedule has about 1 every 10 years. The inter-epidemic intervals of pertussis were remaining the same or getting narrower. In other words, the peaks were shorter, were not as high because you had less cases of disease, because the pertussis vaccine can reduce symptoms. But the inter-epidemic intervals for when that occurred were staying the same or getting narrower. The FDA couldn't understand why would that be. If the pertussis vaccine is preventing transmission, what should happen is that the inter-epidemic intervals get wider and wider and wider until the disease is no longer endemic. That's what happened with measles vaccine. Measles vaccine can prevent transmission. And what you saw over time is that the inter-epidemic intervals for measles became wider and wider until it was declared no longer endemic in the United States. Next slide, please. So the FDA did a study, and what they did is they used baboons because they couldn't purposely expose humans to pertussis, and they were deemed the most immunologically similar to humans. And in this study, what they did is they took naive baboons, so baboons that had never had pertussis, they then exposed them to pertussis, and they then put a swab up their nose every day and tried to culture pertussis. And what they found is that the naive baboons were symptomatic for about 30 days because they could culture the pertussis bacterium from the nasopharynx. They also had more symptoms. On the other hand, the acellular pertussis vaccinated baboons, AP on this chart, okay, These were baboons that were vaccinated with acellular pertussis vaccine, were then exposed to pertussis. They then did the swab up the nose every day, and what did they find? The baboons were contagious for pertussis for actually longer than the naive baboons. Shocking finding. By the way, the convalescent baboons, so the baboons who had COVID, had pertussis, and then were exposed to pertussis again, they couldn't culture any pertussis bacteria from their nasopharynx. They had sterilizing immunity. WP is whole cell pertussis vaccine we don't use in the United States. And that's why the FDA published an article with the title, Acellular Pertussis Vaccines Protect Against Disease, but Fail to Prevent Infection and Transmission in a Non-Human Primate Model. Next slide, please. Well, years went by, and the scientific community kept looking at this issue, and finally all of the actually pharma often funded scientists that study pertussis vaccine held a conference and issued a consensus paper with regards to pertussis vaccine. Here's what they wrote in their own words. This includes, by the way, the World Association of Infectious Disease and other world-leading researchers. The standard medical textbook vaccines called Plotkin's vaccines. Anybody here familiar with that? Okay. So that's the standard medical text, and Dr. Plotkin is the world's leading vaccinologist. The chapter on pertussis vaccine, Dr. Catherine Edwards, for example, one of the authors, is right under. She's also one of the editors of the book. In any event, she's a considered world-leading vaccinologist. As they explained, quote, natural infection with pertussis hosts both mucosal and systemic immune responses, while APVs, acellular pertussis vaccines, induce, that's a typo, I'm supposed to fix that, sorry, only a systemic immune response. Mucosal immunity is essential to prevent colonization and transmission of Bordetella pertussis organism. Consequently, preventative measures such as acellular pertussis vaccines that do not induce a valid mucosal response can prevent disease, but cannot avoid infection and transmission. Acellular pertussis vaccines do not prevent colonization. Consequently, they do not reduce the colon circulation of Bordetella pertussis and do not exert any herd immunity effect. And this is from the literally paid consultants of Sanofi and GSK, the two main producers of the two Tdap and DTaP vaccines in the United States. Okay, are authors on this. So there you have the scientific explanation. The pertussis vaccine is not creating mucosal immunity. You're injecting it in the arm. It may create IgG antibodies, but it's not creating the type of IgA antibodies that you would expect on a mucosal lining to prevent transmission, so you're still getting infected. You can still transmit it. The vaccine does reduce symptoms, so you're less likely to know you're contagious, but you're still contagious. Next slide, please. So the consensus paper was not persuasive. Here's the FDA itself explaining, quote, and this is in the FDA briefing documentation very recently, specifically with regards to pertussis vaccines, and it explains that, quote, acellular pertussis containing vaccines induce helper T cells, memory, and neutralizing antibody responses that effectively prevent symptomatic disease, but fail to prevent colonization and carriage, end quote. Next slide, please. By the way, I also sued GSK for this commercial they had. You see where the grandma, she turns into a wolf. She doesn't get her pertussis vaccine. Right? You see it gets all these sharp teeth and she eat the baby. The implication is what? If the grandma doesn't get a Tdap vaccine, she does what? She kill her grandkid. Right? So we sued them in federal court and said, hey. This vaccine reduces symptoms but not some transmission. So the grandma that gets the shot is less likely to know she has the pathogen in her nasopharynx. So she's more likely to do what? Pick up the baby. You know how long after we filed this class action lawsuit that entire advertising campaign was gone? Very quickly. So in weeks. Wiped. Because, as we allege in our complaint, it's false advertising. The grandma that gets the product is actually more likely to transmit pertussis to her grandchild, not less likely. So consensus paper said it, FDA said it, the economics prove it. Next slide, please. And I know this is why my whole presentation and my book really focused on the idea of between belief and data. I know there's this belief that all vaccines prevent transmission. but this one doesn't. And I don't mean like, it doesn't somewhat. It doesn't. Period. Zero. That's why you give it at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 18 months, 4 years, at 12 months with a booster. And now you're doing it every 10 years, and it's not changing that ecology. Anyway, so if you want to talk about the rights of individuals, which is, as a lawyer, that's what I focus on. You want to get vaccines, that's freedom, get them. And as public health officials, I would submit to you that the argument that you need to mandate the pertussis vaccine to prevent transmission makes no sense. It's actually the opposite. If you're saying that kids who are more likely to transmit pertussis should be excluded from school, then who should you be excluding from school? Vaccinated or the unvaccinated with this product? Who? Based on the logic that you often hear of who's more likely to transmit, you should be excluding the vaccinated kids from school. They are more likely to transmit pertussis, the bacteria. That's just a fact. FDA says it, consensus paper, the lawsuit shows it. It's just a fact. It's an inconvenient fact, and I know it abuts with beliefs, so it creates cognitive dissonance, but that's a fact. Not saying you shouldn't encourage it. Again, it can reduce symptoms, but there is no public policy reason to take away any child's education for not getting this product. It's just punitive. Okay. Next slide, please. By the way, it kind of gets worse, and here's why. The pertussis bacterium has about 3,000 antigens, epitopes on its surface. The vaccine only has 5 in the vial, okay? That initial imprinting, that initial immune response that the vaccine has the body generate to actually being exposed to pertussis, initially called the original antigenic sin, now they call it linked epitope suppression, is the same immune response that vaccine individual will continue to have. So the first time, so they get the vaccine, then they get exposed to pertussis. The immune response that the vaccinated individual will be to have a robust production of those 5 antibodies, but not to the other 2,995 epitopes it needs to be targeting to really neutralize, to create sterilizing immunity. And that happens over and over again. So what happens is, and this is, by the way, not me, I'm just, again, a lawyer. This is Professor Cherry at UCLA, our leading pertussis vaccine expert. And so what happens is that those who are vaccinated with pertussis vaccine, they can be infected over and over and over and over again, constantly being able to continuously, every few months, be contagious with pertussis. Whereas the person who had never had vaccines and got pertussis once has sterilizing immunity, at least for a few years. Some interesting literature on that, what happens after a few years. But for at least a few years, like those baboons who are, remember, convalescent, like everything else, look, they will not become infected. So it's not just that the vaccinated are less likely to have symptoms and can be asymptomatic spreaders. They actually are able to be infected over and over and do it repeatedly, which might explain why the inter-epidemic intervals, according to some data, has not only stayed the same, but have actually gotten narrower. Because we might have more circulating pertussis bacterium in the environment. Again, not true of all vaccines. Some vaccines do neutralize, do create sterilizing immunity. But this is the reality with pertussis vaccine, as explained here. Quote, because of linked epitope suppression, all children who are primed by DTaP vaccines will be more susceptible to pertussis throughout their lifetime. And there is no easy way to decrease this increased lifetime susceptibility. You know, one of the suggestions this article has on how to do it? Create another vaccine that has the other, all the other antigens that are, except for the 5, and then vaccinate everybody with those. Anyway, next slide, please. Okay, so that was pertussis vaccine. Tetanus vaccine, by the way, right, toxoid vaccine, and diphtheria vaccine, by the way, they don't have any actual in the vial. They don't have any antigens from the diphtheria or tetanus bacterium themselves. They just have a toxin that sometimes is released by those bacteria that is now and has been treated with formaldehyde. Okay, so there's nothing in the actual vial of a tetanus vaccine, for example, that can produce immunity to the tetanus bacteria itself. Tetanus is not transmissible from person to person anyway. All right, let's move on to polio vaccine. Okay, the only polio vaccine used exclusively in the United States since 2000, it was the old OPV vaccine, was phased out in the 1990s. Now, oral polio vaccine can create a level of mucosal immunity, so it can, to some degree, prevent transmission. Okay, but inactivated polio vaccine, again, the exclusive vaccine used in the United States, so everybody 26 and younger in the United States, and many folks in the generation before that would have only gotten this product. This product does, again, not prevent transmission. Polio is fecal to oral contamination. The inactivated polio vaccine creates immunity. IgG antibodies does not create mucosal immunity. No IgA antibodies of significance that can prevent you from proliferating. In fact, there's some exposure studies that they did, and you can see them in the literature, that actually reflect that those who have been primed can actually poop out a bit more of polio virus. They use OPV as the challenged virus to make that determination. In any event, here is the CDC explaining in its own words, quote, IPV does not prevent intestinal infection and therefore does not prevent poliovirus transmission. So CDC, just, again, it's a fact. Next slide, please. This is actually on another from the CDC webpage. Inactivated poliovirus vaccine protects people against all three types of poliovirus, meaning it can reduce symptoms. IPV does not contain a live virus, cannot cause disease. It protects people from polio disease, being symptomatic, but does not stop transmission of the virus because it doesn't stop you from the virus from proliferating your intestines and you excreting it and transmitting it onto others. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've now covered 2 of the 5 vaccines required in Florida. They don't stop transmission. The public policy argument for mandating them just falls apart, the whole idea of preventing transmission. Again, you want to encourage them, you want to do, but mandating them is just punitive. That brings us to hepatitis B vaccine. Hepatitis B, unless there's something really odd going on in your schools of Florida, will typically not be transmitted in a setting. In fact, to prove this point, we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the CDC, and we asked them to please provide documentation sufficient to reflect any cases of transmission of hepatitis B in an elementary, middle, or high school setting. The CDC's response was, a search of our records failed to reveal any documents pertaining to your request. Proving a negative is tough, obviously. But in this case, I don't know where else to look. Hepatitis B, just sitting in a classroom, again, unless you've got some really odd stuff going on here in Florida, not going to be transmitted in a classroom setting. Next slide, please. So that's 3 out of the 5 vaccines required in Florida for school. And I very much welcome anybody to take a look at, please take a look at the sources cited there, read them in full. Anybody can feel free to submit anything that they believe is contrary to what I just provided. But obviously, if you're going to argue with that, you're going to argue with the CDC and the FDA for the most part, which is fine with me. That leaves us with 2 vaccines, varicella and MMR. Now, these 2 products can prevent transmission. Let's go through them quickly. Next slide, please. The varicella vaccine, chickenpox vaccine, can prevent transmission, but as its package insert explains, it also can, quote unquote, shed after one is injected with this product. As the package insert explains, quote, transmission of varicella vaccine virus resulting in varicella infection, including disseminated disease, may occur between vaccine recipients who develop or do not develop a varicella-like rash, and contacts susceptible to varicella, including healthy as well as high-risk individuals, meaning those who receive a varicella vaccine can transmit it to others even if they have no symptoms, right? And can transmit it to those who are completely healthy. Hence, the package insert explains that due to the concern for transmission of vaccine virus, vaccine recipients should attempt to avoid, whenever possible, close association with susceptible high-risk individuals for up to 6 weeks following vaccination with Varivax. Does Florida have a requirement for kids who get this product to be excluded from school for 6 weeks? And if not, is it really about public health to require this vaccine for school when you're not even concerned about it being transmitted during those 6 weeks? Or is it really just about a belief in the products versus being data-driven in your decision making regarding mandating this product? Next slide, please. I'll tell you my thinking in that. Our firm, as I mentioned, of 50 folks who represent folks with regards to vaccines. We also represent many what those are called medically fragile children who need medical exemptions. Actually, part of our practice because they get denied around the country in situations where it would make your head spin, where medical exemptions are denied. Families who otherwise, they vaccinate all their other kids, but this one kid who needs a medical exemption. And I've never encountered in all the years we've done this work, a child who's at a neutrophil level, who has a medical state whereby they're only susceptible to harm from the very few pathogens for which we vaccinate, but they're not susceptible to harm to the 1,400 other known pathogens. This child doesn't exist. We represent this community of people because it doesn't make sense. If a kid has SCID X, any infection is probably going to kill them. They're in a hospital setting, they're in a bubble, right? If a child is at a place where they're slightly immunocompromised, but they can handle infections, then they can handle infections, right? It's one of the two. And so, that's probably why, by the way, you don't these kids, for the 6 weeks after getting a varicella vaccine, those kids who are really susceptible to that are probably not in school anyway. Next slide, please. And that leaves us with MMR vaccine. And obviously, the argument that you often hear is that MMR is incredibly lethal. Everybody would die if they don't get this product. And I think that if you want to make rational policy around MMR, you have to be rational about what the actual benefits are and what the actual risks are about this product. Because, as I noted, MMR vaccine can prevent transmission of these particular pathogens. Now, 1963 was the first year that the measles vaccine was licensed in the United States. In the few years leading up to that, there were around 400 deaths in the United States at a time when it was endemic, and everybody in America was infected with measles at one point in their life, pretty much. That amounted to a death rate of 1 in 450,000 Americans. Click forward 2 more times, and for mumps and rubella, here were the annual deaths in the years before the first vaccine. Next slide, please. This is an official chart from the U.S. Public Health Service that was published before there was a measles vaccine in 1960, so maybe less interest in, not worried about how this would look when it was publicized. But this is the decline in mortality from measles in the United States from 1900 to 1963. What you will note is that the decline, and there's the link down there to actually the underlying data sets as well, not just this graph. The mortality from measles declined by over 98% between 1900 and the introduction of the first measles vaccine. I can assure you what did not cause that decline. Measles vaccine, because it didn't exist. So what did? Well, I'll tell you what I think did. It's the work of public health officials. I think they are a big part of that, of the reason it declined. Better living conditions, better sanitation. Go down the list of things that public health officials instituted in American cities during that period. But you never hear them take credit for it on that score for some reason. They always point to the vaccine, even though the vaccine had nothing to do with virtually the whole decline. And by 1960, late 1950s, early 1960s, pockets of this country were still like a developing country, where children will die of any infectious disease, including measles, at a high rate. Okay? And we've also, luckily, have addressed that, and we've also increased our acute care. Issues with measles today are different. I know there was 2 children who have reported have died from measles in Texas. Everybody hear about that? We represent one of those families, and we have the medical records for both of those children. We publicized medical review of them. Those children did not die of measles, though it does make for good media. Next slide, please. Now, on the other hand, even if we attribute all of the decline in measles mortality to the product, which I think requires you to, avoid the history of measles, you have to take account of the other side of the equation. This are the result, what you're seeing on your screen, of a 100,000 person prospective, not retrospective, study in the nation of Japan that tracked over 100,000 of their citizens for 22 years. Okay, funded by the government of Japan, done by its major institutions. And one of the things they look at, I have no idea why, is they looked at mortality between those that had had measles and mumps and those who hadn't. And what they found was that, can you click one more time? Oh, go back. Where's the odds ratios? Oh boy. You got to look at the study yourself. I implore everybody to read it. They're not on the screen, so I apologize. But there was statistically significant decline in the mortality from cardiovascular disease after 20 years amongst those that had measles and mumps versus those that didn't. In fact, around 14% of those that had measles, who had not had measles and mumps, were died from cardiovascular disease after 20 years, versus only 7% of those that had measles and mumps. Incredible finding. If that in fact is reflective of reality, and again, prospective, 100,000 person, and they had, because it was prospective and they had every variable, they adjusted for everything. They adjusted for living conditions, family history, you name it. You can read the study. And they have the unadjusted and the adjusted results, and all of them are bad. They're all statistically significant as to the decline. So if it is true that having measles, for example, and mumps, for example, results in an even 1% decline in mortality from cardiovascular disease on a life years loss basis, because obviously adults versus children dying are of different life years, you are upside down on your public health benefit from this product. I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that's what this data would reflect. Meaning it could be that measles, unlike many pathogens throughout the eon ages that have come and gone, may have actually conferred a survival advantage. I'm not saying it is. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. But this study would appear to indicate that it might, and it should be taken very seriously. Something that should be quite looked at. Next slide, please. The other thing is that now these studies are not as robust as that one. They're not prospective. They're retrospective epi studies. They're a lot smaller, obviously subject to confounders, but they're consistent. There's a long line of studies that found that those that have had measles have a statistically significant decreased rate of cancers as compared to those that haven't. For example, the International Agency for Research on Cancer found that those who had never had measles had a 66% increased rate of non-Hodgkin lymphoma and a 233% increased rate of Hodgkin lymphoma. Collectively, those kill about 20,000 Americans a year. If having measles reduces mortality to some degree with regards to these two particular cancers, you might be saving some kids from the deleterious effects of the underlying disease, measles, but what impact have you had on overall public health? It's tough questions to consider, I know. They're not convenient, they're difficult, because it's clean and easy to just measure public health by an uptake rate of a vaccine. It's a lot harder to try to actually look at the holistic picture of what is the actual overall public health impact. It's a tougher thing to do, and it also abuts with some of the prior recommendations that may have been made, which can itself cause cognitive dissonance. Next slide, please. Putting aside those type of non-specific effects is what we typically call that from the product. There's actually also the harm that the product itself can cause. And so, I know there's a lot of discussion about how robust the measles vaccine was trialed before licensure, but here's actually the reality of the current MMR2 vaccine. And the link right there is to the FOIA documentation. It was licensed based on a clinical trial with 834 children, no control, and 42 days of safety review. About a third of the kids had respiratory and gastrointestinal issues in the trial. There was no control group, so what are you going to compare it against? Nothing to compare it against anyway. So there was, I guess they licensed it. The troubling part about it is MMR2 was a very different product than MMR1, which was licensed in 1971. This was licensed in 1978. It's a very different product because it was, unlike all previous versions, this product had in every single vial, because the rubella component was now grown on the cultured cell line of aborted fetuses, because when you grow a virus in a cell, you can't filter out all the cell components. If you did, and you just were left with virus in the vial. Every one vaccine would cost you like $100 million. So most of you end up with billions of pieces of human DNA and cellular debris in every single vial of an MMR vaccine. But that was only in the MMR2 version. 1978 was not in the prior versions. That and many other reasons make it a very different product. It should have been properly trialed. It wasn't. At the least, they should have used MMR1 as the control. They didn't. In any event, next slide, please. So that trial was, it's useless for us as a law firm to establish or not establish causation, to either establish causation or to rule out an injury, because it's kind of a useless trial on safety front. Can help establish efficacy, but not safety. This was the information statement from the MMR vaccine by the CDC, and you can see some of the harms that it discloses, including deafness, long-term seizures, brain damage, and so forth. Next slide, please. So there was a clinical trial actually finally done on the MMR vaccine when they used the MMR2 as the control to license GSK's MMR vaccine that reviewed safety for 6 months. So you got some data, but since MMR2 didn't have that proper baseline in its own trial, when these results came in, and you can see them on your screen, it was kind of buried in a supplemental table. Both groups had a pretty, when you combine the serious adverse events and the new onset chronic health conditions, the new onset chronic disease, which is kind of a newer thing that pharma companies are doing to make the SAEs, serious adverse events, look not as bad. They break them up now. They're very concerning. About 2% in each group had a serious adverse event. About 3.4 to 3.7% in each group had a new onset chronic disease. And about 10% in each group had an adverse event that prompted an ER visit. Should have been very concerning, in my opinion. But for regulatory purposes, those rates are the same, the control and the experimental vaccine, and so it's deemed safe for licensure. Next slide, please. So, my only point is on the MMR vaccine is that, I'm not so sure the picture is as clean and as clear as we're often told. There's a lot more complexity and nuance to it, and I think that there's certainly should be enough room for people to make reasoned decisions in terms of whether, one way or another, with regards to these products, they should have the right to have informed consent. And to me, the important part is not the informed part of informed consent, because everybody wants to be informed to a different degree. Some people walk in and say, "Doc, I just trust you. I don't want anything. Jab with my kid." That's fine. That's informed. And then they've consented. Some people walk in and want an incredible amount of information, and in between. To me, the important part of informed consent is not the informed part. Because, there's just only so much time in a day, too, isn't there? It's the consent part. That's the critical part of informed consent, is the ability to consent to either say yes or no. And if you say no, but then you're penalized, then you've destroyed informed consent. Okay, next slide, please. All right, stepping back a bit, just going to go through a few other topics that I think our folks may not know about, and I think are really important when you are thinking and making decisions about vaccine policy. You really should know about what I'm about to present if you don't already. How many of you are aware of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act 1986 who are in this room? 1, 2. Anybody else? Nobody. Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, leading up to, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act is a federal law that makes it so that you can never, and this is the only product in America that has this immunity. There's no other product that has the immunity I'm about to describe. It is the only product in the United States where you cannot bring a claim against the pharma company to say that had you made that product safer, my kid wouldn't have been injured, had a chronic disease, or be dead. Only product that has this immunity is because of this law passed in 1986 called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act 1986. As it explains in the law, no person may bring a civil action against a vaccine administrator or manufacturer for damages arising from a vaccine-related injury or death, and their Supreme Court decision reaffirmed that. Next slide, please. Why did this immunity come about? I'll tell you why. Leading up to 1986, there were only 3 routine vaccines. That's it. 3. DTP, MMR, and OPV. The amount of harm and injury they were causing was resulting in every manufacturer to go out of business or stop making it, such that they were left with one manufacturer for each product. That's it. Now, a lot of industries face this crossroads. Okay? Building materials industry, when they discovered asbestos in building materials. Let me tell you, building materials are really, really important. Right? Buildings are important. You need a place to live. Congress didn't go, ooh, building materials are very important, so you know what we're going to do? We're going to give you immunity so you can keep selling your asbestos-ridden building products forever. No. They said make a better, safer building product. Same thing, for example, with cars. Remember gas tanks used to blow up? Who remembers that? Remember? Yeah. The cars are really important, especially today. Can you imagine a world right now without cars? How are you going to get to the hospital? Again, that industry was at a crossroads. Congress did not give the car manufacturers immunity. It said make a better, safer car. The market forces drove that outcome. Okay? Unfortunately, when it came to vaccines, Congress did something unprecedented. It said, you know what? We're going to make it so you don't have to make a better, safer vaccine. We're going to give you immunity for the injuries your vaccines cause. Not only those 3 products, but any other routine injected childhood vaccine you licensed thereafter, including when used by adults. It's what I call the original sin in my book, in any event. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is what a child would receive on or before their first birthday in 1986 if they followed the CDC schedule. Next slide. This is what a child receives today on or before their first birthday following the CDC schedule. Whether one views this as progress or not, the concern and the reason I put this up is that every single one of these products was trialed by a company, save one, the MMR vaccine, knowing they would not be liable for the injuries and deaths that they cause on the basis they could have made the product safer. Creates an incredible moral hazard, and I'll show you the outcome of what those trials look like in a second. Next slide, please. This is the full schedule from 86 to today, and these are just, I believe, the routine vaccines. There are non-routine ones that are not on here. It would make the list longer. Next slide, please. The data reflects that in the early 1980s, under 10% of kids had a chronic health condition in America. The data reflect today over 40%. Some data reflect over 50% off the multiple conditions, and some data reflect that are worse. Next slide, please. What are those chronic health conditions that have exploded? I put some of them on the screen here, and almost all of them, when you look at the literature, are related to some form of immune system dysregulation or dysfunction, including things like, for example, ADHD that you typically don't think about when it comes to immune system. You don't think about that as an immune system issue. Well, I put the PubMed sites down there for each of these diseases, and you can peruse them later and see what the mechanistic science studies have shown vis-a-vis what might be causing these particular injuries. So, and you got to ask yourself, what's causing the immune system of children across the United States to go en masse to have these issues, that you have this explosion of chronic health issues that our immune system related? And I can tell you that the NIH has spent billions looking at genetic factors, no answers. The CDC has spent a lot of money. They don't have answers. Maybe they should start looking at the very products now injected instead of 3 times by age on before at first birthday, 29 times, as maybe a contributor to it. I can tell you that there's about a dozen studies out there that have compared kids with no vaccines to 1 or more vaccines. They're all retrospective EPIs, so they can't prove causation. Some of them, they're all confounded in different ways, but they're consistent. They show the kids that have been vaccinated have multiple times the very chronic health conditions that have exploded during that period. But again, that doesn't prove causation. It's just, retrospective EPI studies that are, you could probably go after each one. I depose vaccinologists all the time, and immunologists and infectious disease specialists and so forth, and go through studies. And so, anyway, that's why I love Japan studies so much, because it's prospective and they control for like everything. That was a really good study. Next slide, please. Okay. And you might say, well, we've assured vaccines are safe because of, we robustly studied them before licensure, right? How many times have you already heard that claim? Let's take a look at that claim quickly. And I will tell you, as a firm, we want good clinical trials for vaccines. And a parent calls and said, my kid got a Hep B vaccine, grand mal seizure within 10 minutes, and then where are we going to start to prove causation? You get a prospective study. We want good clinical trial data. So this is where we would start. Next slide, please. Next slide. Remember I told you I'll tell you the impact of that immunity on clinical trials? Well, here it is. What you see right there is the 4 highest selling drugs by Pfizer, according to Money Inc. That is the clinical trials relied upon to license each of those products. They had safety periods of years against a placebo control for Enbrel, Eliquis, Lyrica, Lipitor, common drugs you all know about. Why? Why did the pharma companies do long-term placebo-controlled trials? Do you think it's because they're altruistic or moral or ethical? They're publicly traded companies. They do it because they're trying to maximize profits. If they put a product out that's going to harm a lot of people, what will that do in terms of profitability of the product? They could end up upside down. So they have an economic incentive to assure the safety of their products to a certain degree beforehand. Anybody here have a retirement account? Anybody? Yeah, a few people. Which way do you want your stock in those retirement account to go? Up or down? Let's go up. Where does Wall Street want it to go? Where do the investors want it to go? Where does the CEO want it to go? Where does everybody in that company up and down the chain, right? It's nothing nefarious about it. It's just capitalism. It's good. It works typically pretty well because what it means is that everybody has an incentive. When they put that drug out, they want to make sure they're at least going to get more revenue than they have to pay out in harm. It doesn't mean, in fact, the product doesn't cause harm. It just means they want to make sure that it's going to, they'll make more, right? So it can only cause so much harm. So they want to know the safety profile before they release it on the market and potentially are exposed to God knows what kind of liability, okay? That's just good business. Next slide, please. These are the clinical trials relied upon to license each of these childhood vaccines given injected 3 times each by 6 months of age. Typically days or weeks and no placebo control. Those numbers look unbelievable, right? Well, if I just saw that, I would not believe it either. Just as your Surgeon General just said to you, that seems crazy. Doesn't seem real. Well, let's take a look at what the underlying data and FDA documents show. Next slide, please. So this is the package insert for CombiVax HB. That's one of only 2 Hep B vaccines administered to babies. Under federal regulations, section 6.1 of each package insert needs to summarize the clinical trial relied upon to license that product vis-a-vis safety. Okay? And so if you will take a look and read together what it says. In 3 clinical studies, 434 doses of a CombiVax HB 5 micrograms were administered to 147 healthy infants and children up to 10 years of age who were monitored for 5 days after each dose. That is the clinical trial relied upon to license this product before it was injected into millions of babies in this country, or licensed to be injected in millions of babies in this country. It has no control. So that alone makes it pretty useless to determining safety. Even if it had a control, it was still useless to determining safety because it only monitors safety for 5 days after injection. And even if it had a placebo control and inert control and it monitors safety for years, it was still useless because it was underpowered. It only had 147 kids. Useless to assess safety. And I'm not trying to be I'm just trying to be technical about it. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to assess this product was safe, I could not do so from this data. I could maybe assess the surface B antigens to see if it created efficacy to some degree, right? But I could not assess safety. And by the way, this is the first recombinant DNA technology vaccine ever licensed in America, period. This was a brand new technology. There's nothing to even compare this against. It wasn't even like you had something existing. It's nothing. I didn't believe this, by the way, when I saw it. So on behalf of ICANN, that nonprofit I told you about before, the FDA, we got the underlying clinical trial reports. They're right there. You can click on them, and you can see the full underlying clinical trial reports. That's what it says. I also deposed the principal investigator who conducted this trial, Dr. Stanley Pock, and I asked him about this trial. Meaning there's no place to look. This is what it is. I know it seems incredible, but you should click on all those links and watch them and read them yourself, because unless I saw it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it. Next slide. The other Hep B vaccine license for infants was Engerix-B, and it's 4 days of safety monitoring. We'll look at two more examples, and then we'll move on. So we don't, almost out of time here. So we'll look at the pneumococcal vaccine. So Prevnar 7 was licensed based on a clinical trial in which, again, I can't make this stuff up, another experimental vaccine was used as a control. That is from the package insert. It was an investigational meningococcal group C conjugate vaccine. So very first pneumococcal vaccine ever licensed in the US, they could have used the placebo control. They didn't. They used another experimental vaccine as the control. That sounds like it can't be true. I wouldn't have believed it either. But you can go to the FDA website and see it for yourself. It's right there. Click, please. This is actually a peer-reviewed study from a bunch of FDA and CDC folk who actually explain, quote, prior to licensure, the control group in the main study received another experimental vaccine rather than a placebo. And so they're like, well, we can't really assess safety from that trial. At least they admitted it later after the fact. Didn't go back and correct it. Next, click, please. Then when they went to license PCV13, they used PCV7 as the control. And what they found is that in babies, remember, given at 2, 4, 6 months of age, serious adverse events, which means something very serious in the FDA, death, disability, hospitalization, and so forth. Serious adverse events reported following vaccination in infants and toddlers occurred in 8.2% among Prevnar 13 recipients and 7.2% among Prevnar recipients. For the purposes of regular licensure standards, since they were similar, experimental control group, that's deemed safe for licensure. I would submit to you that is, but it's not safe in reality, meaning because your baseline, Prevnar 7, was not properly trialed. So how do you know that that 7.2 reflects safety? But it does for the purpose of FDA regulations. I've sent them endless torrents on this, and they don't have a good answer. Next slide, please. Gets worse. Then when Prevnar 15 was licensed, serious adverse events up to 6 months following vaccination with the 4-dose series reported 9.6% of Vaxneuvance recipients and 8.9% of Prevnar 13 recipients. But deemed safe because, why, quote, there was no notable patterns of numerical imbalance between the vaccination groups. So deemed safety for licensure purposes, but from an assessment of whether it's actually safe in the real world, I do not believe this data reflect that because it's a pyramid scheme almost. You starting with your base of Prevnar 7, which you never properly trialed. Use that as the base for 13 and then that for 15. Next slide, please. I'll do one more. The 2 DTaP vaccines that we have licensed here, the control was DTP vaccine. DTP vaccine was never licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. Studies that have looked at DTP and mortality have found, a majority of them have found actually the deleterious effects from this product in terms of mortality. In fact, they have found that more kids die after DTP vaccine than those who don't get the product. Now, they might be protected from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, but the all-cause mortality numbers are higher. In fact, in the seminal study from 2017 by WHO, promoted scientists and vaccinologists found that actually kids who got DTP only died at 10 times the rate in the first 6 months of life as compared to those that did not. Inconvenient finding, I know, but there's a whole series of these studies. You can click on that link. In fact, we actually specifically have a long letter exchange with UNICEF about it. They cannot provide data to show otherwise. We even petitioned the International Criminal Court to prosecute UNICEF for continuing to promote this vaccine, despite the fact that the data reflects they're killing more kids than they're saving. The International Criminal Court told us they can't take this up. I don't know who else to turn to, but that's what the data reflect. So DTP was licensed based on a trial with DTP. DTaP was used DTP as a control. DTP, when the best possible study to because you can't do a retrospective, you can't do a clinical trial. We withhold DTP. They'll say it's unethical. So the best available possible evidence is this study because it was looked at DTP when it was introduced into Guinea-Bissau, meaning not in a post-elimination environment. It was done based on birthdays. That's how they vaccinated. So it was naturally randomized. And it had kids that got DTP only and nothing. So it was the closest thing you're going to get to a good study. This is it. You got actually an accepted method of randomization. You've got in a quote-unquote pre-post-elimination environment, and you've got no confounders with other potential vaccines. This represents the very best study you're ever going to have whether DTP kills more kids than it saves. This is it. Because you can't do a prospective study. They tell you it's unethical. But yet, since it's still a retrospective epi, they say it can't prove causation. Meaning there will never be anything better than this, but yet they'll say it's still not enough. This is my exchange with UNICEF. Next slide. What I'm about to say is categorically true, even though I know I get fact-checked for all the time. That's because the fact-checkers and Reuters and CNN refuse to look at the underlying documents. Okay? But you guys will do that. So, and then you'll know this is true. There's not a single routine injected childhood vaccine on the CDC schedule that has been licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. And when another vaccine was used as the control, which can be appropriate if that vaccine was properly trialed, because that would be the standard of care, right? That vaccine was never licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. This shows you that exact chain, what you have on the screen, and you can, all these citations are in the document below. You can see what the control was, and you go down the chain. Next slide. That's for the birth to 6 months. This is 7-year-old and older. Next slide, please. Even if you did have a control, the problem is that you're often not reviewing safety for long enough. This shows you the solicited and unsolicited safety review periods in the clinical trial relied upon to license vaccines given the first 6 months of life. Days and weeks, or even 6 months, is not sufficient to know what immunological, neurological, developmental issues a baby is going to have after getting a vaccine at 2, 4, and 6 months of age. You need to track them for years. They don't do that. Next slide, please. I will show you an example of one vaccine that did have a long-term placebo-controlled trial. And I think the reason is it's not a routine recommended vaccine. Hence, the company is liable for the injuries. Because the 86 Act only protects for routine injected, routine recommended vaccines. This one's not. Dengue vaccine is not. Could you click it one more time, please? Thank you. In this trial, they reviewed basically death for 6 years. 6 years. They had a placebo control and they had over 30,000 individuals. So decently powered, in my opinion. But could have been better, but still. About 2 to 3 years in, okay? 2 to 3 years in, something they would never do with any other vaccine. They found that kids under 6 were dying and having serious injuries at a higher rate who got the product versus those who didn't. So it's not licensed for kids under 6. It also found that for kids 6 and older who got the product, who had never had dengue, died and had serious adverse events at a greater rate than those who didn't get the product. So it's not licensed for children who have never had dengue and are over 6. This product is only licensed for kids who have had dengue and are older than 6 years of age, because otherwise, if you give it to them, they are likely to have a higher rate of death. Kind of like we saw in the DTP vaccine, except for DTP, it wasn't based on a clinical trial, and decades after it was licensed. This is what they found. I submit to you, and now I'm speculating, that had they done this kind of trial for all the other childhood vaccines, we'd have a very different looking childhood schedule today. But this is not what was done, unfortunately. And I think it's the 86 Act that drives that outcomes, that immunity that I was talking about. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This just talks. These are just congressional reports looking at the pharma-connected individuals sitting on FDA committees. Next slide, please. This is actually from the British Medical Journal explaining that it's unethical to recommend a product that hasn't been properly trialed. So query whether or not it's ethical to recommend a Hep B vaccine or any of these other vaccines if they weren't properly trialed. Not me saying it. This is what the ethics literature would reflect. And you have to, obviously, as a medical professional and public health official, make the decision of whether or not you think that the current vaccine, childhood vaccines that are required in Florida to go to school actually can be ethically recommended given this standard. Next slide, please. Post-licensure safety. Next slide, please. And so, they say that, okay, you could say, fine, before licensure, it's not properly trialed, but after licensure, they robustly assess safety. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. Again, I can say that from my own practice. This, for example, is a 2012 Institute of Medicine review that looked at one of the CDC and another agency in HHS said are the 158 most commonly claimed injuries after vaccination to assess whether they're causally or not causally related based on a review of the whole medical literature. What the IOM found is that 5, there's enough scientific literature to reject a causal relationship. For 16, the evidence favors a causal relationship. But to me, that's not the damning finding. It's that for 134 of them, the IOM said you just haven't done the studies to assess whether or not this commonly claimed, what the CDC says the most commonly claimed injuries are actually caused or not caused by vaccination. Vaccinologists will tell you those 134 are not caused, even though there's no evidence to support that it is not caused. They use the absence of evidence to say it's safe, even though that's not a way to say it's safe. That's just, all you can say is that there is enough evidence to reach a conclusion, but that's not what they will tell you. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to use vaccines cause this claim that vaccines don't cause autism. I don't want to get into vaccines and autism, but it's a good litmus test on whether or not they properly studied vaccine safety after licensure. Because the claim that vaccines don't cause autism is the claim that they claim to most thoroughly and completely studied and debunked. Hit play, please.
We're not sure as a scientific community what causes autism, but we know that vaccines do not.
Vaccines are really the one thing we have looked at as causing autism.
Yeah, and I agree with you. We know that vaccines don't cause autism. The science is clear.
Vaccines don't cause autism.
I do not deny in any way that we need to do more about autism, but it has nothing to do with vaccines.
Let me be clear. Vaccines do not cause autism.
Vaccines don't cause autism.
Absolutely sure.
Absolutely sure.
Okay, CDC website, vaccines do not cause autism. Next slide, please. And so you would expect there to be a whole lot of studies, and you'd also expect that they've at this point persuaded the parents of children who've got parents whose children are autistic that vaccines didn't cause it. Yet surveys reflect that still 40 to 70% of parents with an autistic child still point to vaccines as what they believe causes their child's autism based on their parental experience. Next slide, please. And what vaccines do they point to? Next click, please. They point to the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life when you look at these surveys, as well as MMR vaccine not given before 1 year of age. So if you're going to claim vaccines don't cause autism, you better have studies that show that these vaccines do not cause autism. Next slide, please. Well, the concern that vaccines cause autism, by the way, did not originate in the late 1990s with MMR vaccine, though I know that's how it's framed in the media. The concern originated with pertussis vaccine. Next click, please. Because in the 1986 Act that we talked about when it was passed by Congress in 1986, it actually directed HHS to look at 11 conditions that were apparently commonly claimed to be caused by pertussis vaccine. And one of those is autism. As provided in the federal law from 1986, the Secretary of HHS shall complete a review of all relevant medical and scientific information on the nature, circumstances, and extent of the relationship, if any, between vaccines containing pertussis and the following illnesses and conditions: autism. So long before any 19 other controversies, Congress asked that HHS review the relation between pertussis vaccine given at 2, 4, 6 months of age and autism. Next slide, please. HHS commissioned, one more click, please, commissioned the Institute of Medicine to conduct that review. And here's what they published in 1991. They said no evidence bearing on a causal relation, meaning they could find no evidence, period, no studies, nothing had been done. No category of evidence was found bearing on a judgment about causation, meaning they're not saying it does cause autism, they're saying it doesn't cause autism. They're saying, I don't know, you haven't done anything to study the question. Fine, fair enough, right? Early days. Next click, please. The Institute of Medicine again was asked to look at this condition of whether pertussis vaccine causes autism. Remember I told you about the 158 most commonly claimed injuries that CDC asked Institute of Medicine to review? That was published in 2012. And one of the conditions that still remained among the most commonly claimed injuries from pertussis vaccine was whether or not was autism. And so they looked at all the epidemiological evidence. They could only find one study that studied DTaP vaccines and autism, and actually found a correlation, but they threw it out because they said, quote, it lacked an unvaccinated comparison population. It's funny how that happens. When it shows a harm, they always throw it out for that reason, but they're happy to use studies that lack an unvaccinated control to show that vaccines are apparently safe. In any event, they could find no studies to support that DTaP vaccine does not cause autism on epidemiological evidence, nor mechanistic evidence, and hence the Institute of Medicine concluded in 2012, the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relation between diphtheria, tetanus, and cellular pertussis vaccines and autism. Again, not saying that vaccines cause autism, to be clear. They're just saying, but you can't rule it out either. So you still can't say vaccines don't cause autism. You need to have studies that show it. Okay, next slide, please. By the way, for those who say, well, how can you rule out something? Well, here, this is in that same 2012 report. they did accept 4 studies to conclude that the evidence favors rejection of a causal relation between MMR vaccine and autism. See, studies can be done to rule out, apparently, that a vaccine causes autism, meaning they proved a negative, so to speak. Right? You could do the studies, and the very same IOM report shows that that's possible. They didn't do it for the pertussis vaccine. Next slide, please. Click. And the Agency for Health Research and Quality at HHS again did the same review and reached the same exact conclusion. It also ended up finding only one vaccine with regards to hepatitis B, and that's the only study it could find on Hep B vaccine and autism, apparently. And it found that kids that had Hep B vaccine the first month of life versus those that didn't had a 3 times risk of autism. Okay, that was statistically significant. By the way, this study was just retracted over a decade after it was put out. I've been using it too much, so it had to go. Next slide. It was, by the way, at the University of Stony Brook. Galvin Goodman, you should read the study. You can be your own judge whether you think the study should be retracted. AHRQ found it to be actually one of the few reliable studies in its report back in 2014 when it published this. Didn't find any issues with it. Anyway, that doesn't matter. Next slide, please. This was me deposing the world's leading vaccinologist with regards to that 2012 IOM report. Please hit. This is an excerpt from the IOM's report, right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you read the causality conclusion with regard to whether DTaP and Tdap cause autism?
The evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, or acellular pertussis containing vaccine and autism.
If you don't know whether DTaP or Tdap cause autism, shouldn't you wait until you do know, until you have the science to support it, to then say that vaccines do not cause autism?
Do I wait? No, I do not wait, because I have to take into account the health of the child.
And so for that reason, you're okay with telling the parent that DTaP, Tdap does not cause autism, even though the science isn't there yet to support that claim?
Absolutely.
So, and I think he's being honest. He's under oath. He's being honest. He's saying, look, I will tell a parent that this vaccine does not cause autism, even though I have no studies to show that it doesn't. To his credit, he was honest about that. And I've seen that repeatedly. Next slide. Actually, one more click. And so, but to round it out, we actually we sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the CDC, giving them another chance. And we asked them specifically to provide all studies relied upon by CDC to claim that DTaP vaccine does not cause autism. We did the same for Hep B vaccine, HIV vaccine, IPV vaccine, and Hep B vaccine, meaning the 5 vaccines injected 3 times each in the first 6 months of life. The very vaccines those parents were claiming were the cause of their child's autism. Next slide. And so the CDC provided us no studies. We then sued them in federal court. And then as we approached the date of the hearing, they finally provided a list of 20 studies. I called the DOJ attorney and I said, listen, I got your list. 19 of these have nothing to do with the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life. And one of them is the Institute of Medicine report from 2012 that actually looked at the DTaP vaccine and could not only find one study and it found an association, but it was thrown out. So your list has one study on it with regard to the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life. Are you sure you want to settle on this basis? And he went back to the CDC, his client, and they did. And what you see on your screen is a stipulated order signed by, I signed on behalf of my client, the Department of Justice signed on behalf of the CDC, entered as a federal court of the federal court, and click one more time. And if you go and look, I implore everybody to read those 20 studies, and what you will find, 18 of them involved thimerosal, not an ingredient in those products, or MMR. One involved antigen vaccine exposure that admits it can't rule out vaccines as a cause of autism, and one involving MMR, thimerosal, and DTaP, the 2012 IOM review we just looked at, meaning the CDC did not produce any evidence to support that the vaccines given in the first months of life do not cause autism. Next slide. I'm not going to play this because we are out of time, but this is a deposition I took of another world-leading vaccinologist in a case involving autism and vaccines. And I went through each one of these again. I said, do you have any studies that show that Hep B vaccine does cause autism? Each of them. And she said, no, I don't. She's one of the 4 authors of Dr. Catherine Edwards of the Plotkin, editors of the Plotkin vaccines book. Next slide, please. And this is the reality. They've studied MMR vaccine in terms of vaccine. Next slide. They've studied thimerosal, but that doesn't rule out that vaccines don't cause autism. Next slide, please. But the good news is, I guess, that the autism vaccine page under Secretary Kennedy has now been updated to actually finally reflect the reality. And what it says on here is that pursuant to the Data Quality Act, which requires federal agencies to ensure quality, objectivity, and utility, that the statement vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim. The scientific studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines contribute to the development of autism. And it said that the reason that it was made historically is to prevent vaccine hesitancy. Unfortunately, that's not a good reason not to do the science. You got to do the science, and then you can make the claim. Anyway, next slide, please. I'm not trying to, again, I'm not trying to get into vaccines and autism in any way, but I bring it up, one more click, please, to make the point that, autism is the post-licensure harm that is claimed to have been most thoroughly studied. And if it hasn't, which it hasn't, okay, imagine the state of the science as to all the other well over 100 serious adverse events like parents commonly report from vaccines that just go unstudied. I know that there's a perception, a belief that there's this massive, robust body of scientific literature that supports vaccine safety. If you had to do what we have to do at our firm when a parent calls us and look at the clinical trial and then look at the full post-licensure safety literature database in PubMed, you would conclude very differently. There's what is said, and then there's what the reality looks like. And I tried to give you a glimpse into that with autism. Again, not to get into autism. And to be clear, I'm not saying vaccines cause autism. I'm saying that they have not done the studies to rule out that vaccines cause autism. Whether the vaccines cause autism, different question. Okay, because I'm sure that when there's a news article about this, that's all I'll say. Because they'll talk about autism. And I said that vaccines cause autism. I'm sure they'll say that. Okay. Next slide, please. In terms of getting a glimpse, now normally, if I was going to prove that via some various drugs cause an injury, I sue the company, you get the underlying internal documents, and then it's often the way you can establish that that product causes a harm. Well, you can't do that with vaccines because they have immunity, but there is a glimpse that you can get into the vaccine companies and what data they have. And that's because of this federal regulation. It provides that the package inserts, typically in section 6.2, should include, quote, only those adverse events for which there's some basis to believe there's a causal, not correlation, causal relationship between the drug and the occurrence of the adverse event. So when you open that big piece of paper up, in the package insert, those they're only supposed to be listed an adverse event if there is some basis to believe it's causally related. Next click. So for example, for Moderna's COVID vaccine, this is what they disclose: basically fainting, myocarditis, pericarditis, and allergic reaction. Next slide, please. This is what they disclose on that Hep B vaccine given to babies. And I think you should take them seriously if they're disclosing it, because they're only supposed to do it if they have some basis to believe it's causally related. What are they relying on? What data are they using to make this conclusion? I don't know, because I can't sue them. So I can't get that underlying data, but they have something. I don't even think the CDC or public health authorities have that data. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go mortality, and I'm going to wrap up. Next click. This is what the CDC tells the public, that between 1994 and 2023, 1.1 million lives were saved from vaccination in the United States. I get this claim put at me in legal papers all the time. Problem is that it's just not true. It's like off by 99.9% at least, based on the available data. And I'll show it to you in 3 minutes, and then we'll be done. Next click, please. First of all, I should point out that as this publication explains, it ignores all confounders, all of them. Okay? That is the opposite of how you're supposed to conduct any kind of study. It says, quote, factors other than immunization, such as hygiene, might have contributed to lower disease risk in recent decades, and reductions resulting from these contributions have not been incorporated into the model. Every other factor, proven to acute medical, you name it, ignore it. It's the opposite of what you should be doing. You should be trying to control for confounders. They did the opposite. Fine. There's a reason it has no confidence intervals, because they can't. It could be the result is that it caused 1 million excess death, or instead of saving 1 million, You don't know because there's no confidence intervals. How could they? They don't even control the confounders. And then I'm going to show you how the data is unreliable. Next slide, please. So of the 1.1 million lives saved, 750,000 of those were claimed to have been saved from diphtheria alone. So pretty significant percentage of them, right? They're claiming that they're saving 25,000 Americans a year from diphtheria, from death, every year in 1994 to 2023. That is a data-defying claim. First of all, in the leading up to, in 1948 was the year before the DTP vaccine just started being routinely recommended in the United States. Okay, there was 634 deaths from diphtheria, and that was after over 97% decline from 1900 to 1940. None of that's accounted for. You look at the chart on the right from the U.S. Public Health Service between 1900 and 1920. I believe it was 6, you had about 80% decline. There was 0 diphtheria vaccine. The very first one in 1926 up until the 1940s was deemed ineffective because the areas where it was used and not used had the same decline in mortality. It's cited to there. So when they finally came out with a product that they deemed effective in 1949, which is the year of the first licensed DTP vaccine, you'd already are down to 634. How do you get to 25,000 deaths? Has nothing improved since 48? Acute care, you name it. And I go through it in more detail in my book. We're out of time. I'm going to stop there. Next slide, please. With hepatitis B vaccine, they claim 3,000 Americans would have died every year from Hep B, are saved from Hep B vaccines, which accounts for 90,000 of the 1.1 million lives saved. In 1980, the year before the very first Hep B vaccine ever, there was only 294 deaths from hepatitis B in the whole United States. I don't understand how they get to 3,000. By the way, since introduction of the hepatitis B vaccine in 1981, which was based, the first Hep B vaccine was not recombinant DNA. It was using blood albumin. It was maybe using human blood for those who had chronic hepatitis B carriers. And then it was discontinued soon thereafter. So next slide, please. And then there's the measles vaccine, which I won't get into. They're claiming about 2,800 lives are saved a year from measles in the United States, which we've already gone through measles. It's data defying. And when you read the study, or this study, you'll understand. Next slide, please. Here's the reality. What I have on the chart here is the number of deaths in each year prior to the licensure of any given vaccine. Now, this is far from millions. Every death is a tragedy. Every death is a tragedy. But we got to be, we can't be hyperbolic and make a totally unsubstantiated claims like 1.1 million lives saved, because overstating the benefits can be just as dangerous as understating the risks. When you look at these numbers, and then you look at the mortality decline curve before introduction of the vaccine and afterwards, at best you can attribute it to the vaccine, the acceleration of that decline. And I go through that in detail in some of the cited material in my book, and you can see that in terms of, well, how much do vaccines really contribute? Obviously, a child that, if you make measles no longer endemic, so nobody will die of measles, okay. And measles vaccine can save a life from measles. And you can stop there and say, that's it. And that's where most of the engagements I have want to stop. But it's a lot more than that. And you also have to be rational about what the actual overall public health benefit and cost is from these products. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Okay, last slide. So I'm going to end on a legal point, which is that which is what I said about consent earlier. This country, now they're getting 250 years. It was founded on the idea that all those forms of government that preceded the founding of this country. And what was that? What was the central theme of all those kinds of governments? It was that somebody else gets to tell you how to live your life, whether it's a dictator, king, central authority, and so forth. This country was founded on the idea we have inalienable rights and that we need to respect individual and civil rights. And to be sure, those come with dangers, letting people say what they want, assemble with who they want, practice what religion they want. But we as a country, and it's not been perfect, and we have aspiring closer and closer to that goal, I think for most of our history have made the judgment that the greater danger is always ceding those rights to government. Okay, so I submit to you that public health authorities have billions of dollars on the federal and state level to get their messaging out, to persuade on the merits. They have the bully pulpit of being public health authorities. People don't want to hear it from a lawyer. The lawyer. You guys have MDs, PhDs, MPHs. They will trust you over a lawyer. Many reasons. Bad lawyer joke, sorry. And so you have the bully pulpit, you have the ability to persuade, you have billions of dollars of taxpayer money at your disposal to persuade. Do that. If you do that in the manner you believe is appropriate. But that's where it should end. It should end at persuasion, because the moment that any government agency tips over into supporting mandates in any way, what happens is that they again get beholden to that position, because you've now taken away somebody's rights. I've seen this happen. And to go backwards, it's hard for government to go backward. Anyways, becomes very difficult and become more and more entrenched in those policies where rights have been taken away. And so, in the spirit of what this country was founded upon, the individual and civil rights, and in the spirit, I guess, of increasing the amount of the public trust in health agencies, because there's going to be a time where you're going to really want the public to trust in public health agencies. There will be very important things that public health agencies will tell the public, and you'll want the public to listen. Mandates destroy trust, probably destroy the most important tool that public health authorities have, which is to get the public to listen to them when there really is a true crisis and emergency. And so, this is my pinned tweet. Pin it because I believe it. And it's really my only ideological position when it comes to these products. Get them, don't get them. That's freedom. That's America. But there shouldn't be mandates. And that's because mandates, they're the tool of bullies, criminals, and dictators. If a patient refuses a medical product after being conveyed the benefits and risks, then that is called informed consent. They were informed and did not consent. Mandating over that subjection is immoral and illiberal. Thank you very much. Okay.
Very much, Aaron. Just because of the time, anyone who wants to ask Aaron Siri questions, please up. But else, if you feel free to do whatever you need to do. So Aaron will be here for more questions.
Thank you. Okay.
Speed read